Hello everyone, this is Lala and today I'm going to go through Era 1 and talk about my opinion regarding Era 1. So this is going to be an Era 1 breakdown, analysis, recap, so on and so forth. So with this, I'm going to talk about the evolutions that were made during the era, the seasons in the era, though talk about it more on a summarized point of view, talk about the cast in the era, who are the best strategically, who are the best socially, who are the best characters, who are the faces of the era, all of that jazz. I don't know how long this is going to be, and I initially was planning on doing a live, but I just thought, you know what, screw it, I'm just going to record it. Anyways, finally having access to the early challenge seasons and watching most of the era twice really was a sight to behold and such a very interesting experience. Watching the game show come to fruition really is insightful and such a serene experience. Now, first season really wasn't the challenge, even Veronica said this on Dirty 30, and was retroactively added many years later. Seasons 2 to 4, so this is Road Rule, Real World Challenge, Road Rule, Real Worlds 2000, Road Rules Real World Extreme Challenge, had some emphasis on some competitiveness due to the Road Rules and Real World teams, but there were still no eliminations. They left separately in vans, and it's essentially a Road Rule season regarding the structure of the seasons. The casts were a lot smaller, where they ranged from 5 to 12 people on each of the 4 seasons, and no other season since this had such small casts, so you did get to focus on them a bit more, but in general, these seasons just have not aged well whatsoever. Another note to mention is that with the first 4 seasons, there are no returning challengers, so it's kind of like Big Brother and Survivor in this element regarding the lack of returnees in this period, where one season had one cast, the next season had a completely different cast, the season after that had a completely different cast, so there's really no continuity in that regard. So that's why I made the comparison there. We do move on to what some would call the second half of this era, from Battle of the Seasons to the Inferno 2, where people were actually voted out throughout the season or they're actually eliminated. So either way, people left throughout the season, and it's not just everyone making it to the end. So you need to work even harder to stay in the game to get that title and the prize money. A part of me wanted to split this period into 2 halves, with Battle of the Seasons and Battle of the Sexes not having any eliminations, but vote-offs, and the seasons being the 5th and 6th seasons being one half, with the Gauntlet and the Inferno and the Inferno 2, with the first two being the 7th and 8th seasons, and having eliminations being the second half. The issue with this is that Season 9 is Battle of the Sexes 2, and they went back to having no eliminations, so essentially had the same format as Season 6, the first Battle of the Sexes, and somewhat Season 5, Battle of the Seasons, where that season had vote outs during the first half of the season, but it went back to having the format of the first 4 seasons with no one going home in the second half. But either way, I can't split this period into 2 halves, with how especially Battle of the Sexes 2 kind of ruins that continuity. With this in mind, I do consider Battle of the Seasons to the Inferno 2 to be the second half of the era. Another element of this era that is different than the first half of the era is that there are returning challengers here. So people who are on the last season come back to do another season, rookies can become veterans, veterans continue their position on the show, and because of these intertwining relationships, they continued working together. And because of the consistent theme of returning challengers, a lot of the storylines from previous seasons can be carried over into the current season, and a lot of storylines from the current season can be transferred over to the next season, which cannot be said for the first 4 challenge seasons. It adds a continuity to the show that really was missing, and it gives the challenge its own identity in the reality TV landscape, since most reality shows do not have returning players anywhere near to this magnitude. Eliminations, of course, added a different and a more exciting layer to the show that also made it stand out from Road Rules. Choosing who to go to elimination or who went into elimination, also brought another element to the show, and it added a lot of drama too. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of the personal drama, but this added competitive drama that just wasn't present in a lot of those other seasons. Another thing that I forgot to mention is that with Battle of the Seasons onwards, everyone stayed in location, where in the first 4 seasons they traveled to a bunch of locations. And some of these seasons had the entire cast living in one house. And even if they did live in different houses, mainly the Battle of the Sexes seasons, they are in walking distance from one another. So there's still a lot more interaction here. Now I'm going to go through each season, look at the cast, talk about the notable people from each cast, and then give my summarized versions of the season overall. I really don't have much to say about Road Rules All Stars because it really was a one off Road Rules spin off with the real world alumni in it, and it wasn't considered a part of the challenge during the season or even during the era overall. Veronica mentioned on Dirty 30, which was filmed and aired in 2017, so 20 years after this season was filmed, and almost 20 years after it aired, that her season, which is the third season, is actually the second season. So clearly stating that this season isn't a part of the challenge, and I know Mark Long has said this over and over again. So if the alumni don't even consider this to be a part of the challenge, and it wasn't considered it up until more recent years, why should I have high regard for it? The season was 5 episodes. There's only 5 people on the cast. They did all of their missions. There really wasn't a competitive element to it, since no one was competing against one another. There really was not a memorable moment in the season, outside of maybe Eric snapping over not doing a challenge again. We did see the first showmatch turned marriage here and potentially in reality TV history, though I'm not too sure about that, but there's really just nothing here. The cast also didn't accomplish much in the grand scheme of things on the challenge. With Rachel never returning, and with some people not considering this canon, she technically isn't a challenge alumni. Sean only doing 1 season, which he did win in Battle of the Seasons, and some might consider him to be a newbie there. John doing 2 other seasons and flopping immediately on the both of them. Cynthia doing 1 flagship season after this, where she did poorly and was under-edited, and an all-star season where she is booted first, with Eric being the only one who did other seasons and did well with his performance on both Battle of the Sexes seasons, where he was out a few rounds before the final on the first one, and he obviously won the second one. And he also hosted Battle of the Seasons, so he is the only significant challenger from this group. And he is an arguable face of this era. But when comparing him to some of the other faces in this era who would have much bigger impact on the challenge overall, not just in this era but outside of the eras, it'll be interesting to see where or if he holds up. Now we are moving on to season 2, or as some would call season 1 of the challenge, called Real World Road Rules Challenge. Outside of the retroactive stuff, Real World Road Rules Challenge is considered the first season to most of the alumni, and it does make sense. It is the first season to have 2 teams competing against one another. It is the first season that actually has the Road Rules alumni in it, and it's the first season that has winners and losers. There were some fun challenges here, but it really is like a week-long camping or road trip, and there really isn't anything that carries over from this season to other seasons, outside of Montana and Beth's feud in the Gauntlet too, but even that's somewhat of a nothing burger. Looking at the cast, you do have people that stand out more, like Beth, who would go on to do many seasons in this era, though she makes a bigger mark in era 2, in my opinion, and still does all-star seasons to date. And Mark, who did 3 seasons in this era, hosted another season in this era, made sporadic appearances on the flagship in all of the other eras, while not only playing in All-Stars, or not just playing in All-Stars, but conceptualizing it, and it causes him to be seen as the OG, even in this season. There were some others that did return, like Roni, who was kind of under the radar on the Gauntlet, despite doing well on the season. Nathan, who was on the Gauntlet and also made it to the final on that season, is someone who I completely forgot about, so that's not a good sign. I found Anne to be okay in Battle of the Sexes, but none of the 3 of them are that notable, though Roni would have a solid enough run on All Stars 3 for someone who wasn't on the show for damn near 20 years at that point. Montana is the only other one who did more than 2 seasons, but when you look at it, she was out very early on Battle on the Gauntlet, and she had a decent enough run on the Gauntlet too. But in general, just a few 2 to 3 era wonders. Some of them performed poorly on those seasons, and or were under-edited, so they didn't really leave much of a mark. And then you had people who didn't return, like Anil, Jason, Janet, or Akefla, who didn't return to the flagship, but did return for All Stars, and Kaylee is also someone who didn't return. There were a decent amount of flirtmances or showmances, but none of them are really notable, and in general, I just don't have anything to give to the season in general. Alrighty, so I've made it clear that I think Road Rules versus Real World Challenge 2000 to be the best one out of the first four seasons. And I feel like this because there's a lot more interesting discussion amongst the cast. I do feel like there's a lot more drama in comparison to the prior two seasons and even the season after this. And I also think that it had the perfect length. It isn't too short for the format that it is, but it isn't too long, which I think is the case with season 4. It was clear to me that they definitely had a bigger budget for this season with some of the locations that they went into and some of the cameos that came in for the season. But when you look at the actual cast, I do find it to be pretty interesting. Most of them did come back, which is a different scenario than the last season. So, like, yes, he had 3 flagship seasons, but he flopped on the latter 2. But he more than made up for it on the All Stars spin-off and the World Championship. So he kind of boosted his resume there. Veronica is the first person who did many seasons on a challenge season, where she did about 6 or 7 seasons in this era. So when it comes to the face of the era, I do think it is Veronica just based off the amount of seasons she did. Though a few of those she went out pretty early, but just looking here, she did this season, Battle of the Seasons, Battle of the Sexes, the Gauntlet, the Inferno, Battle of the Sexes 2, and the Inferno. And she did make a few sporadic appearances on the other eras. So she did 1 Era 2 season, 1 Era 3 season, and 3 Era 4 seasons, though those seasons she was nowhere near as impactful. And she has done several spin-offs up until today. And looking at some of the others, we have a few 2-season and 3-seasoners. So Dan did his 3 seasons all in the era, and he was very funny in the seasons. Holly had her few seasons too. I felt like she was okay. Oh, I forgot. Battle of the Seasons. That's where she had that villain arc, if I remember correctly, with her husband, especially on Battle of the Seasons. Piggy had her second season where she flopped, though she was a part of a few other seasons, though they edited her out, if I remember correctly. Obviously, I know about the Inferno, but apparently that might have been the case with the Gauntlet or one of the Battle of the Sexes seasons. I'm not too sure. Amaya had Battle of the Sexes. She was kind of just there. Davis Burns was on 3 seasons. Who is that? Hold on, let me look him up. Oh, the Gauntlet 2. I guess I'll see that in the future, but in general, I don't really remember a whole lot about him. Though he apparently did very well on the Inferno and was out right before the final. So I guess he wasn't a flop challenger, but maybe not the most memorable. So I'm pretty sure he had a few moments I probably forgot about. Everyone else, so like Lost, Heather, Tech, and Kat are 1-season wonders. I don't remember much about Mike Lambert, who did 2 seasons. Tech did do the first 2 All-Star seasons where he showed a lot of personality there. So in general, I do feel like this season is more full compared to the prior season when it comes to personalities and the amount of seasons that they did. And I think the cast is really the reason why this season is the best out of the first 4. Since if it was a weaker cast, the season would have been lower. But the format in general is just really, really bad. Also, if I remember correctly, I believe they filmed last season and this season back to back, and they aired it back to back as well. So they were clearly getting invested in the challenge overall, just from that information there. Okay, so Veronica is one of the only people from this era, or from this season, I will say, that could be considered a face of the era, while people like Dan and Holly did 3 seasons, which was definitely a lot during this era. but Holly was kind of a middle of the road presence at best, despite her doing decent. And this then, he did very well, as obviously, I think he won the season, or whatever, you don't go home in the season, so it doesn't really matter where he placed. He got to the final on Battle of the Seasons, and then he won a Battle of the Sexes too. But despite all the success, I don't remember a fucking thing about him on a personality or a character level. So despite his success, I don't think he was one of the faces here. And now we're moving on to the final season in this mini era in Real World versus World Rules Extreme Challenge. So this season is also one that I thought was somewhat interesting pertaining this mini era that it was in. But the main reason why it isn't first is because this season is way too long. So the last season had 9 episodes, if I remember correctly. The second season had 6 episodes, and the first season had 5 episodes. This season ends up having like 15 or 16 episodes. See, no, there's 18 episodes, including the reunion. So really, it was 17 episodes. And honestly, I know they got more seasons because the last few were very successful, but material-wise, the season did not justify having that many episodes. So, looking at the cast, a decent amount of them did a few seasons here and there. The only few who were one-season wonders were Rebecca, Camila, Christian, who would have been interesting had he came back, and Michelle, rest in peace to her, but the others had a decent amount of seasons. So I think the main people from this era is Julie and Cyrus. Julie did 4 seasons in this era, though she was booted early on Battle of the Sexes, and she had big seasons in the Inferno and some at the Inferno too. But I wouldn't call her a face of this era specifically. If anything, she was either a very important supporting character, but not a face, and she would have one more season in Era 2 before that ended. And Cyrus was definitely a supporting character, though he did 3 seasons in the era. He definitely had a lot of moments in his eras, but he was never pushed as much as some of the others were. And he had 2 seasons in Era 2, which we'll definitely get into, so he was one of the few from this era who made it to the next era. And then he had a run on All-Star, since he was on 3 All-Star seasons. Emily had an interesting 3-season run, though Battle of the Sexes is where she really was pushed up there, but I guess it was too much for her, and she didn't come back afterwards. Though she was kind of a supporting character in Battle of the Seasons, who was still important to that season. Rihanna did her 3 flagship seasons in this era, and she wasn't a main in any of them. Though her personality is just so unique, so despite her not being a face of the era, she definitely brought so much to the seasons that she was on, whether she was booted early or she made it far. And she had her 2 All-Star seasons as well. Latyrian did 3 seasons. He was a supporting character in those. He was kind of, I wouldn't say a laughingstock, but he was pretty close to being such on the seasons. And of course, he had his All-Star run where I believe he was on 3 All-Star seasons. It was either 2 or 3, but it kind of changed how people saw him. Susie is an interesting case because she did 4 seasons, but only one of them was in Era 1, and the other 3 were in Era 2. So while she's definitely an important character and challenger, her impact really wasn't on this season. It would be on next season. So that's something that I found to be personally interesting. But in general, this season suffered from the really crappy format that they really needed to change, and I'm so glad that they did change it after this season. They really tried to work with what they had, and you can definitely see the budget increases here, but it just wasn't enough. And I think they realized that if they wanted their show to continue, this Road Rules format just wasn't going to work, and I'm glad it changed. So, kind of like last season, most of the people from this season ended up returning where they either had make or break performances, but I wouldn't say any of them were the faces of the era or had anyone who was that important compared to the other three seasons. In general, I did feel like some of the challenges here were cool, others weren't. There was a lot of interesting discussions that were happening and interesting topics, but unfortunately, the format was just really, really, really poor. And I felt like this is one of the seasons where the edit really screwed some people over, where some people were just very invisible. I also forgot to mention interesting Dan was on this season where he had a solid 3 season run. Though, yeah, he was a mid-season boot on Battle of the Sexes, so he definitely made his mark. Though it was mainly from his humor and personality, and not based off him being a good challenger. Now we are moving on to Battle of the Seasons, the 2002 version. And I feel like here is where we got a whole new crop of rookies. And because it's based on them getting a certain amount of people from each Road Rules or Real World season, or most of the people from those seasons, they had to be very specific with who they chose, who they wanted to represent what season, and they also had to be very specific in which veterans that they were going to bring back. And with this being the first season where veteran challengers are a thing, which are people who did more than one challenge, this is a huge change, and it's something that would essentially never leave, since there's always a season after this where there is a veteran. And the challenge really became the show that it's known for due to the veterans and people consistently returning, which made it stand out from most of the other reality shows. So with this, we have a whole bunch of people to get into. So I feel like Mike and Coral are the standouts with this newbie cast, where they became the huge faces of the era, as they did well in pretty much all the seasons that they were in on this season. They got the most confessionals, they had the most storylines, they had the big personalities. MTV always shoved them down our faces, and their interactions with people really what carried a lot of this era, so they're definitely deserving of this. Mike is especially one of the faces because he started and finished in this era, and once he got successful in his wrestling career, he moved on. Coral's definitely one of the faces right along with him, and their friendship and interactions was the backbone for a lot of their seasons, though she would have a few seasons in era 2, though they weren't anywhere near as successful. So Timmy's kind of interesting since some would say that he's a face, but I'm kind of iffy on that. He might be in the ring underneath that, where he has 4 seasons overall, but 2 of those seasons are in Era 2, and 2 of those seasons are here. He was definitely very funny. He got a lot of confessionals, and he was very funny as well. Theo is someone who did 4 seasons, and he's definitely another one of the faces, as he did well in essentially all the seasons that he was on. And his final season, which was Fresh Meat, was in Era 2, but his 3 Era 1 seasons are the ones that are important. He had a lot of storylines, he had a lot of rivalries and friendships that were focused on, so yeah. The only other people who did more than 1 season was Elka, who was pretty middling overall, though she was a bit more interesting on her 2nd season. Norman, who I don't remember much about in general. And the only other ones who did more than 1 season is Jalisa or Gisela, hopefully I'm saying that correctly, and Adam. But they were never really faces. Adam is someone who could have been a face after the Gauntlet with the drama he got into and the hookups he got into, but he didn't do another season for a few years, and when he returned on the first Era 2 season, the Gauntlet 2, that kind of ended his journey on the show, though he's going to have a run on All-Stars, since he was on All-Stars 4 and he will be on All-Stars 5. And Jalisa is someone who always performed poorly, unlike Adam, and she never really just took off here, especially in her run on the flagship show, though she did do well on the first All-Stars. I do feel like this cast had some solid one-timers, so I feel like what was his name? Chadwick was a very interesting 1 season wonder, despite him not lasting long. Bilou is someone who is very interesting, and there was no one really like her. And that's pretty much it. But in general, you definitely saw the evolution of strategy with this season, with some people voting off based off of performance, while others doing it based off of personal reasons or strategic reasons that didn't involve keeping the best people. There's definitely some drama here and there, especially with Steven having his moment and a lot of political stuff. But I feel like the season could have been higher. But they went back to the format of the first four seasons in the second half of the season, where no one goes home and they do a bunch of generic tasks. So I do feel like that weakened this season specifically. And it didn't have consistent format, and it really seemed like they didn't really know a whole lot about what they were doing. But Battle of the Seasons was very important because it gave the platform, or the starting platform, for what the challenge would eventually come to be. Now that I think about it, there weren't a whole lot of returning players, though people like Sean and solid veteran seasons, Peggy, Veronica, and Yes ended up getting booted early, as well as John and Beth. That's actually kind of interesting now that I think about it. A lot of the veterans didn't last long here, though we had things like the hurricane, which was very interesting, and the house just having a party in the middle of the hurricane and having that toga party. I thought that was interesting. Then there was the drama with Bilu's baby, but things fell apart after the first half of the season, which is why I can't rank this season too high, but you can tell that they're starting to figure out something here. Eric and Mark were pretty good hosts. I didn't know that Timmy was asked to be a host, but he said that he wanted to compete instead, so that was pretty interesting. Overall, the season was a lot better than the prior four seasons, but there's still a lot more work that needed to be done. But a lot of the templates for what the challenge would become was started with this season. Now we are moving on to Battle of the Sexes 1. And what I noticed about this season, as well as last season, is that they just threw in a bunch of people on each season, where these casts end up being way too bloated compared to the first four seasons where they're way too small. So I think that's why so many of the people, not only on this season, but on last season, were just very forgettable in general. So we have some vets like Julie, Beth, the Tyrion, Gisela, and Yes, and even Amaya just performing poorly. So that's kind of why there's a lack of faces at this point of time. So we did have people like Mark and kind of Eric stepping up to the plate. Emily had a really good run here. And Anne did as well. Ayana lasted a while, though she wasn't a face. Cyrus and Veronica also had pretty solid seasons as well. So, there were a few vets that stuck around, though I think the only ones who were faces at this point, or were like hugely focused on, was Mark. Yeah, especially Mark. We did have a lot of good one season wonders, in my opinion, and rookies as well. So when it comes to the one season wonders, I think Ellen was a very strong one season wonder. I also really like Melissa too. Puck was definitely an interesting character, though he's definitely problematic. Gladys being pregnant was something, though she herself wasn't interesting at all. And we did have newbies here who would become staples. So like a Shane, though he himself was not a face, especially in this era where he was kind of, I don't want to say the token gay guy, but you can tell that was one of the reasons why he was cast, and they didn't really push him to the forefront enough where he could become a main character, especially in this era. Though he partook in every single era, though he was less sporadic in his appearances in Era 2, Era 3, and Era 4, though I guess the Era 3 and Era 4 were close enough in proximity. And I think that's why a lot of people kind of forget that he's an Era 1 person. Tanya is someone who was on 4 seasons in this era, but I feel like she didn't really become a face or a main character until Battle of the Sexes 2 and the Inferno. Where in her first 2 seasons, I did find her to be very forgettable. Though her main character status from the last 2 seasons in this era would continue into her run in Era 2, and we all know why she stopped after Era 2. Anissa is the one who was on the most seasons out of the women, but looking at her 2 seasons here, honestly, she was barely a supporting character. I didn't remember much of her in her first season, and while I did find her to be a bit more memorable in her second season, she was still overshadowed by the likes of Veronica, Rachel, Tina, and Carl at this time. Obviously, she would have many seasons in Era 2, many seasons in Era 3, and many seasons in Era 4, and I'm sure she'll have many in Era 5. So despite her never really being a main, she's definitely an important supporting character, and she was also on the two Champs vs. Stars and also on All Stars 1. So she has become a notable figure in the challenge, and an important one as well. Rachel definitely became one of the faces in this era, especially with the Gauntlet and the Inferno 2. Honestly, even Battle of the Sexes too, despite her lasting halfway there. Her forgettable season is her first one where she has that the inner circle is ugly moment with her early boots, but in general, she didn't add much to that season. And her appearances from the other three eras would be more spaced out, like the Island and the Duel, then Battle of the Exes, and then finally Battle of the Eras, while being on All Stars 4. Honestly, I think this season was interesting despite of the format and not because of the format. Apparently, Dan revealed on, I think it was the special before Battle of the Sexes 2, that the guys agreed to not argue or disagree on camera because they want to quote unquote look good. And this just shows why this format is just so crappy. The guys were more focused on looking good on camera than providing an interesting show or providing an interesting strategy. And the strategy was essentially just look at the leaderboard. Whomever is the worst will get booted. But the women, they definitely brought it this season. They definitely had a lot of drama. They had some strategic moments, but a lot of the strategy was also personal. And then you had Puck and Ellen really just giving it to one another, though it's definitely side-eye worthy now. But in general, the summer camp vibe really works here because you can still tell that there was a lot of tension, there was a lot of conflict, and honestly, the season, when you watch it, it's just fun to watch. You feel good, you get invested, and that's something that I couldn't really say to the fullest extent compared to the prior seasons. And despite me not liking the Battle of the Sexes format, I do think the format was more consistent here than it was in any of the other seasons, hence it being higher. At the same time, I do think that they're still kind of struggling to figure out what to do with the season. But this one was popular, and it did have more consistency, with people being eliminated all throughout the season, which is definitely something that wasn't the case last season overall. I also forgot to mention that Ruthie is someone who had a very strong debut season, and I think she was someone that they were starting to push, especially as the era went on. But the issue with her is that her personality just wasn't very strong. So, despite them pushing her, there wasn't as much that she could offer. And with the change in competitions and stuff, she performed worse and worse as each season went. And she'll be phased out by the end of Era 2, though she did reappear in All Stars. Is also someone who won all of his seasons, and despite him not being a rookie, I forgot to mention him on the Extreme Challenge, but he is someone who won all of his seasons, but on a character point of view, he really just didn't offer anything of note, so there really isn't anything that I have for him here. Oh, I also forgot to mention that James and Emily's relationship finally happened here, and they caused quite a stir in the season as well. With Emily becoming a villainess, but I guess it was just too much for her, and she never came back after this. And how can you forget about the Puck and David drama, which definitely took over the first episode? And then there was is it Melissa or Melinda? Melissa calling out Julie for her shifty behind the scenes way, where she sabotaged a lot of the alumni's bookings, and Julie getting booted because she, just like Beth, were vehemently hated. And then Gladys being pregnant and then allowed to stay on the show for as long as she was. I also forgot to mention that this season is the first one where they broke away from the real world versus road rules format, which has been consistent from season 2 up until now and will be brought back for the next two seasons, where they went with men versus women, which on paper would seem interesting as it brought a lot to the Survivor seasons that did it at this time, but it didn't come off well on the challenge. When I think of the Gauntlet, I think solid, decent, maybe even good. but it just never gets to the heights that a top tier or even arguably an upper tier season would have. But there really isn't much wrong with it at all. Actually, that's a lie. There's one thing that I don't like. I didn't like how men and women faced against one another in the eliminations. And obviously, we have to talk about the eliminations being introduced in the season, and it was a huge change in the dynamics of the game, and it's something that would become a staple on the show, with the exception of season 9. And this also gave a different element to the game where someone could be good at finals, someone could even be good at dailies, but it doesn't mean that they're good at eliminations. And someone could be good at eliminations, but they may not be good in finals, or they may not be good in dailies. So it added that dichotomy there. When you look at the cast, I honestly think this is around the time where they really figured out that the vets that they were going to work with and that were going to become the faces or good supporting characters. And I feel like they were struggling with that with the last 2 seasons. Now, just looking at the cast here, we do have a decent amount of solid to good rookies. So Katie is someone who didn't last long here, but she definitely made her mark on this season, and she would arguably become a face during the later part of this season with the Gauntlet, the Inferno especially, and Battle of the Sexes too, though that would somewhat be underwhelming for her. But they were really pushing her at around this point in time. Tina, I don't know if she was someone who was the face of the show at this point in time, but I do feel like her importance just grew and grew with each season. She was an early boot here. She did very well on Battle of the Sexes. I think she was eliminated right before the final. And then the Inferno 2, she made it onto the final. And I feel like that momentum continued for her in Era 2 with Fresh Meat, but obviously that fell apart with what she did on the Duel. And now she has done several All-Stars seasons in recent years, and she is currently on Battle of the Eras. Trishelle is someone who I felt like could have potentially been a face since they really focused on her interactions with Mike and Coral, who are the stars at this point of time, but she flopped on her second season and she really didn't come back for several years. The season after the Inferno that she came back on was Battle of the Seasons in 2012. And this is almost a decade after her last season, and she couldn't regain that momentum in general. And she flamed out on Rivals too. So the thing with Trishelle, she would have a decent season and then she would flame out. But I guess she just didn't have what it took. Abram is someone who I definitely feel like was one of the faces during this period, and they were heavily pushing him from this period onward, especially in the latter portion of the era, as his interactions with several people, his romances, his hookups, his zany antics were definitely emphasized here during the 4-season run that he made during the era. And while he did do 5 more seasons in Eras 2 and Era 3, his appearances were a lot more sporadic, and there are other faces that became more prominent than he did. So he was a decent enough supporting character during his last 5 seasons. Alton is someone who was definitely a very good competitor, but when you look at the seasons he did, they were very sporadic and they weren't much at all. The Gauntlet is the only season that he did in this era, and he was definitely at his most interesting here, where he definitely got into some drama and he definitely got into some fuckboy antics. Though the Gauntlet 2 and the Inferno 3, which are arguably some of his more impressive seasons, were on Era 2, then he disappeared for a very long time and then had a disappointing season on Battle of the Seasons, though he did return for All-Stars 1. So he is someone who's a very good competitor, but he would be a solid but inconsistently appearing supporting character. Kara is pretty much similar to Alton, but she only did 3 seasons, and 2 of her 3 seasons were earlier on in Era 2. So if anything, she had more impact there than she did here. And Darrell is someone who is very interesting when it comes to his trajectory, as he was on 3 seasons in this era, and they're all obviously later on in Era 1 since he debuted in late Era 1. But he was never really the main character in any of those seasons. He had great confessionals, he got into some drama here and there, but it was always just spur-of-the-moment drama, and the storylines were never really that consistent, outside of the showmance that he had in the Inferno. Durrell did appear in many more seasons, but they're a bit more sporadic in comparison. He did Fresh Meat, then he was off for a few years to do The Ruined, and then he came back for Fresh Meat 2, where that was his first flop performance where he went home first. He went away to, I believe, get married and have his children. Then he came back in The Invasions. He had a very strong season there. Then flopped on Dirty 30. And then he would become a bit more consistent here as he did Double Agents, Ride or Dies, and Battle of the Eras in Era 4, which was in a 3 to 4 year time period. And during that time, he also did All-Stars 1, All-Stars 2, All-Stars 3, and World Championship. So within the last 3 to 4 years, he's been his most active regarding his challenge career. But despite the many seasons, I don't think he was ever the face of the show. I think he was in a tier right below becoming a face. But despite that, we did have one season wonders. So Sarah, who only did one season, but she had a very great season, and she's the Rookie of the Year. Dave was pretty forgettable. And Rulon didn't offer much aside of being Landon's showmance. I don't have much to say about Rachel and Matt. And Steve only did one season on the flagship, but he's made a name for himself on All-Stars 2 and All-Stars 4, where he had a decent run in All-Stars 2, he had a very strong run in All-Stars 4, and he's going to be on All-Stars 5. So out of 4 seasons, 3 of them are spin-offs and within the last few years. Now, looking at the veterans in comparison, I do think some of them had decent enough showings. Actually, no. All of them with the exception of Tanya. She really did do well in the season. And I think this was Laterian's last season on the flagship as well. So he had a poor season here. Veronica and Rachel would win the season. They had pretty strong seasons after their earlier boots and being betrayed, and I think their early betrayals caused them to be a lot more villainous from this point onwards. Theo, of course, did well as usual, and he was very funny. I felt like Adam really came his own in the season, though he wasn't likable and he was a villain. He had a strong season here, but he wasn't really that consistent, which is why he never thrived. Mike and Coral also had a lot of tension with one another in the season, and of course, their relationship was very interesting to watch, whether it was positive or negative. But they, as usual, had a strong season here. And I really did like the format of the season, with the exception of the eliminations not being gendered. They paced everything very, very well. But while this season just doesn't really have many lows, I can't really say that it has many highs either. And some of the most memorable moments here aren't as high as some of them in prior and even succeeding seasons. So I'm kind of just like, it's solid, it's good, but it's not one that hugely stands out overall. But this has a pretty good rookie cast, a pretty good vet group who becomes a focus, and it has a solid format, and it really set the stage for what would become the norm in a challenge season. So for that, I do appreciate the season. I think from a storytelling point of view, this season is also pretty solid, as the Road Rules was mainly about Sarah being thrown in consistently and what and whom is this, who not only just whom is considered strong or good performer, but what consists of a strong performer, whether it's someone who does well in elimination, someone who does well in dailies. That's the first season where this dichotomy really comes in. And like I mentioned earlier, the Road Rules, which really involves the drama of Mike and Coral, whether it's their dynamics with Trishelle, Coral not being seen as the strongest person, Mike being seen as more cutthroat in comparison. And a lot of the drama involves the game. There's not much personal stuff here. But at the same time, everything's kind of just very linear and pretty simplistic in comparison. While I feel like they started getting it right with the Gauntlet when it comes to the formatting, eliminations, focusing on the vets that they really wanted to consistently bring back, in addition to keeping the cast smaller, I didn't mention that in the Gauntlet, but from the Gauntlet and the Inferno, the cast overall is a lot smaller than what they were in Battle of the Seasons and Battle of the Sexes. So I do think that's a positive for those 2 seasons. But the Inferno kicked everything up a notch. Of course, we have to talk about the format where 2 people are voted into elimination and then they have the chance to win the lifesavers. So the lifesavers are kind of the challenge equivalent to the veto competition in Big Brother, where the people who are nominated can win it to save themselves and there would be a replacement, or someone who's not nominated can win it to keep it, to either keep it the same or to save someone. But with the lifesavers, that means the person who wins it would end up taking that person's spot if they save the nominee. Yet again, here we have the nomination, which is really the one episode, or the nomination and then initial daily, which is the one episode, and then we have the lifesaver and the elimination, which is the second episode. So it's something kind of similar to the Gauntlet, where they did an elimination every 2 episodes, and they were very consistent with that the entire season. But when you just look at this season, they really brought it, and they really amped up the drama. Veronica and Katie was something that was built up from last season, and it really blew up this season as Veronica finally owned her villainous persona, as she was just very cutthroat, and she was running stuff, and she knew it, and she reveled in it. And Katie, she really didn't take crap from anyone. She was going to sabotage her team if they kept on fucking with her, and she was very vocal in general. And then you, of course, have the breakup with Chishal and Mike, and obviously her continuing to pick fights with Coral. That made the first few episodes very interesting, though that ran its course. Mike and Coral had a few moments between one another this season, but it was nowhere near as much as last season. Then, of course, you have Coral and Julie, and what do I even need to say about Coral versus Julie? It's easily one of the best feuds in the entire challenge, and the thing that sucks about it is that they never compete on a season together after this. So many quotable lines just from that one exchange, though they had many in the season, but the main one at the episode where Julie gets booted is the most memorable one. You definitely had Leah and CT going at it during, I think, it was during her final episode. Mike showing his ass towards Kendall, which really wasn't a good look. And I think most of the cast just brought it, whether it was from a drama point of view, from a competitive point of view, and from a gameplay point of view as well. And yeah, I don't really have a whole lot to say about the gameplay mechanisms. It was just really, really fun, and it's really, really iconic. And you can definitely tell that they're inspired by Fear Factor with a lot of the eliminations and the dailies and the lifesavers, and even just a lot of the set designs that they've decided to do. But it really worked for the season. I definitely have to say that. And you can definitely tell that this is during the period where they're starting to focus more on the drama and more on the extreme stuff. And the summer camp vibes was essentially dimming season after season after season after season, which is definitely something that needed to be done. So, looking at the cast of rookies, I have to say that this is one of the big flaws of the season, where most of the rookies really didn't offer much to the table, or they didn't last long on the challenge. So, you have Mallory, Leah, and Kendall, as well as Christina, who are one-season wonders. Most of them didn't bring much to the table, with the exception of Kendall, and somewhat Leah in our last few episodes, though Kendall would have an interesting run during the first 3 All-Star seasons recently, so she kind of had a revival there as a character and a competitor. Ace is someone who has been on 4 flagship seasons and 2 All-Star seasons, so I thought he would have been more prominent here, and he only did 2 seasons in this era, where he is the first boot on the Inferno and the second boot on Battle of the Sexes too. So he was nowhere close to being a face, and something tells me that he's not going to be a face or do well in any of the seasons at all. And the only person who really accomplished much of anything from this rookie class is CT, as he was the runner-up on both the Inferno and the Inferno 2. He was a very strong competitor on both seasons, as he started winning a lot of the lifesavers in both seasons, though I think he won more in the Inferno 2. He was definitely the douchey guy, though, while he had his bit of drama in both seasons, he really wasn't the main character in Era 1. One, because he came in so late in the era, but number two, he was just a side character in those seasons. It really wasn't until the duel where he became main character energy and the face of the show energy, which is one of the reasons is partially due to his relationship with DM and some of the drama he got into on that season. And from the duel onwards, he is just the face of the show. Whenever he's on a season, there's always going to be storylines, competitiveness, drama that involve him. But that just wasn't his role on the Inferno and the Inferno 2 or Era 1 in general. He appeared on many seasons in Era 2, Era 3, Era 4, and he did the Champs vs. Pros spin-offs. So, from the rookies, I definitely do think we had a strong group of veterans. Trisha had a pretty fun flame out. Shane was pretty decent, though not the most memorable here. Veronica really grew into her own villainous era during this season, and she wasn't with Rachel or Atina at all, though her drama with Katie really just brought it. Tammy was of course very hilarious and very competitive. Katie came into her own, and she had a very strong underdog arc in this season. Daryl was a bit more prominent in the season with his showman, and his humor got better. Abram really was just on his prime this season with his wackiness and being better competitively. Coral and Mike really continued their run of just being the faces of the show and everything really revolving around them. Cyrus had the old guy jokes, but he had a very good season here as well. Julie was just a chaotic effing mess. And while I didn't like a lot of her actions, like trying to take off Veronica's safety harness and the carelessness that she had with Coral during their fight, especially the last one. I would be lying if I said that she didn't contribute anything to the season, though she definitely did. And of course, there was Trisha's early flame out. Overall, the season is very strong, and it's arguably the best out of Era 1. It just improved off of everything. They got rid of a lot of the summer camp vibes. The competitive vibe was definitely more focused on, though they didn't use the character and the strategy elements of it. And you can definitely tell that we're getting closer and closer to Era 2 here. Okay, so I hope I don't have much to say about Battle of the Sexes 2. And honestly, this season is just very disappointing all the way around. I have no idea why they'd go back to a format where, one, it didn't cause for an interesting game since half of the cast were duds gameplay-wise since they only went by performance. But two, the format automatically benefited the men, and this is something that the woman called out a lot, not only during the season, but the reunion. And yes, I did watch the reunion after I published my season review of this, as I was able to find it afterwards, where it inherently benefited the men over the women, and it's not a shocker that they dominated here even more than the men did on the first Battle of the Sexes. And honestly, it would be one thing if they had eliminations, but they didn't even have eliminations as they went back to the boring vote-outs. And a lot of the vote-outs weren't even well explained here either. Of course, the men went right back to the, oh, this is based off performance. And that's how they voted throughout the entire season. And the women, they voted based on whatever they decided at the moment. But it was nowhere near as interesting as it was on season 6. And I really do think a lot of it had to do with the cast in the first season and in this season. And also, they knew what to expect with this format. So they kind of played around it. And it just wasn't anywhere near as interesting. And I also think around this point is where the veterans, they were using the show to fuel their college tours or their bar tours or the club tours, so they weren't that into the game. And another thing about this season that I really didn't like is that everyone was so happy and so accepting of getting voted out. It really took a lot of the intrigue, fun, interest, and suspense and stakes in it, where everyone was so accepting of it and you knew exactly what was going to happen. What I will say about this season is that it is the first sequel season when it comes to the theme, as obviously Battle of the Sexes was done in season 6, and they redid it in season 9, this will be something that they do a lot, especially in the next 2 to 3 eras, though, mainly in Era 2 and Era 3. And they even did it in the next season, which is the final Era 1 season. So that is something that's hugely important. And another thing that is very important to the development and the foundation of the show and the game overall is the vet versus newbies dynamic, where you saw it on both with the women and the men, where the women vets got together, they were more protective over one another because they have experience, they knew one another better than not only the rookies knew the veterans, but the rookies knew the other rookies, and they used it towards their advantage. And you see that with the men, which they admitted on the reunion with people like Eric, Mark, Mike, and some of the other vet males agreeing to work together, and they're going to base it on quote unquote fairness, but whenever they can sack a newbie and keep her on a vet, that's exactly what they did. And they kept Mike around a lot longer than they should have because he's a vet. They screwed Brad out of being in the final, despite him being nowhere near close to the worst man performance-wise when it was Eric, so that's something that they definitely used to their advantage. And Brad really held that anger and annoyance even up until the reunion, and he was one of the few who was upset about their elimination. And you even saw the vet versus newbie dichotomy come in when Adam was voted out earlier on in the season. So when you're looking at the rookie cast, there's a decent amount of them who do not come back whatsoever, so look at Kay, Angela, Sean, Chris, Nick, Randy, Steve, Sophia, and Arissa. And there are some one season wonders who might have been interesting if they were given another chance, like an Arissa or an Angela. Oh, I also forgot to mention that Sophia and Arissa, both finalists, they did appear on one All-Star season, but they didn't do much there. At the same time, we definitely do have a decent amount of rookies who made names for themselves. So people like an Adam, who was definitely more prominent on Era 2, since he did 4 of those seasons, though he was never a face of a show, and he ended in early Era 3. You have Derek, who did 2 seasons. Obviously, he was booted early in this season, but he made it to the end in the Inferno 2. He proved to be a very good competitor. And then he did many Era 2 seasons. I think he did most of the Era 2 seasons, if I'm looking at it correctly. He was essentially the 4th person in the JEK Alliance, though he didn't do a lot of the nastiness that they did. The Gauntlet 2 was obviously his breakout season there, so he was, I don't know if he was the face, but he was either one of the faces or borderline in Era 2. But he was definitely not a face in Era 1. One, because he debuted way too late, and 2, he was a supporting character at best. And after Era 2, he barely appeared on the show, only appearing once in Era 3 and once in Era 4. Robin definitely had some momentum going this season and even in her next season because of her relationship with Mark being a thing that would definitely follow her throughout her first few seasons. Though she was definitely a lot more prominent in Era 2 as she did 5 seasons there. And she did 2 early Era 3 seasons, and her final season on the show also ended with Mark, who she started the show with. So her and Mark are kind of tied together when it comes to her experience on the challenge overall. And Brad is someone who definitely is one of the main people of Era 1 that is known now, and who is still doing All-Star seasons, just like Derek, where he did Battle of the Seasons 2 and the Inferno, where he didn't make it to the final in either of the seasons, but he definitely had his character moments, and he was a good enough competitor. He did 6 Era 2 seasons, and I think this is where he became a bit more prominent, especially with his relationship turned marriage to Tori. So he was an arguable face here, but not one of the faces here. And if not one of the faces, he was definitely one of the highest supporting characters in Era 2. But he ended up retiring at the very end of Era 2, and then he came back sporadically for a few appearances in Era 4 after completely skipping Era 3, but that was obviously post-divorce. Now, when you're looking at the veterans, I don't have too much to say in comparison, as Veronica and Katie were definitely a lot more muted this season compared to their past 2 seasons. I feel like Rachel is someone who got a lot of the villain edits compared to Tino or Veronica, so I guess she grew as a character here. Genesis flamed out. Ayana and Cynthia also flamed out as well, though at least Ayana has a memorable moment. And Lisa is a bit more important this season, though she really just wasn't one of the more important people in general. Tanya started becoming her own character this season as she had her hookup with Theo. So Theo also delivered on that element as well as the comedy. And Tanya really started becoming hated with the women here. Ruthie had a solid season as she barely missed the final, though personality-wise it just wasn't there. Tina had a really strong season here where her humor was very strong. She got into a lot of drama. She just missed the final. And Coral, while this is probably her most forgettable season in the era, she still had a strong season as she got into several arguments with a lot of the women. She and Eric even got into it at one point. Her and Robin had a feud. Coral was really the leader of the women, and she really had to take reins, and she was a lot more self-serving with her gameplay here. And just looking at the men, of course, Ace flopped, though he showed a bit more personality here. Abram had his showmans with Coral, but in general, this is a calmer season for him. This is Mike's worst performing season, though he still got a lot of camera time and focus this season. Shane was kind of a middle of the road positive. Not too prominent, but he had a solid enough season. He also had his interactions with Nick that were interesting, and it showed another element to the struggle of gay men on reality TV. I feel like Mark finally started having a personal storyline this season with his relationship with Robin, which would carry over throughout his next few seasons. I think he's narrated a lot more, and he had that huge sacrifice where he took himself out of the running so Arisa could stay in the game, and which would give the men a better chance of winning, and so Eric could win the season since Eric missed the final there. So Mark started becoming more involved in the characters and the storylines and the relationship element here. Eric had a pretty strong final season. He had his few character moments, and of course, he had this obsessive skipping rope that he shoved in everyone's faces. And I mentioned earlier, Theo had a strong season where he won yet again. He had his showman with Tanya, and he was humorous. Dan was still pretty boring in general. So overall, that's my thoughts on Battle of the Sexes 2, and you can definitely tell that a lot of the veterans here were becoming big-headed. I can tell that they're starting to move on, or they wanted a long break, as some of them would definitely take breaks after this season, and some of the others only had 1 or 2 more seasons in them before they either retired or took longer breaks. So, the Inferno 2 is the end of an era, as one of the reasons is that Road Rules was officially cancelled at around this point, so this would be the last of the newbies being cast from Road Rules, since there is really no one else, and they got whomever they could get from the last Road Rules season. And due to them knowing that Road Rules was essentially over, they decided to switch the format, or the teams, from that being of Road Rules and Real World to good guys and badasses. So they essentially put the people who they saw were good on one team, and they did the same thing for the people who they thought were bad on another team. And I do think that it added to some interesting dynamics where a lot of the good guys, they are trying to hide a lot of their more deceitful behavior and trying to portray themselves as in way on camera, while the badasses were a lot more free to engage in drama, be a lot more cutthroat in the game, and they didn't have some of those stipulations. Honestly, the cast brought it this season when it comes to the drama, the strategy, the gameplay, and you can definitely tell that the show was somewhat going to a darker direction, which is where we would take Era 2, or take into Era 2, and the summer camp vibes are completely gone with this season. And like I mentioned regarding the last, I guess not Battle of the Sexes 2, since they went large there, but the first Gauntlet and the first Inferno, this cast is smaller too, and I feel like with this being a smaller cast, it caused a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them to be more developed here. So John flopped yet again, and this is his final season. Robin and Beth were early boots, but they definitely brought some drama and some very memorable moments, so I can't even hate on them. And I do appreciate what they brought here. Brad, of course, had his Reggie moment, and he really started to become more comfortable with himself due to not being stipulated by the veterans. And he is a veteran at this point in time, so he didn't have that holding him back. The trio of Veronica, Tina, and Rachel really were like the three-headed devils. They embraced it. They really didn't care. They were definitely not nice. They had some drama. They were very cutthroat in their gameplay. And Tanya, she really brought it this season. She got drunk. She got into many hookups in the season. She got into so many fights. She really just didn't care. She didn't hold back whatsoever. And I really do appreciate that, since I mentioned earlier that I feel like her first two seasons were pretty forgettable in general. Derek and TT were pretty cool enough this season, though they were side characters here. Derek was definitely a lot messier and a lot more fun here, and even in his first few seasons compared to his latter seasons. So I do find him a lot more interesting here. CT was still pretty douchey, but he wasn't heavily involved in the storyline, so he did get into his fair share of fights with people like Dan and Caramel throughout the season. Abraham was honestly just awful with how he argued with people like Tina throughout the season. I think he and Darrell even had a few tiffs. His supposed alliance with Mike was a huge focus during the season, though it really wasn't like that. Julie was definitely a lot more muted and tame this season, though a part of me thinks that it was herself producing herself to appear that way, though she still had her shady commentary and her awful antics as well. Mike had a really good final season, as he wasn't hooking up with anyone, or not really. He was a lot more focused on his wrestling persona and doing well and wanting to prove that he can perform, partially due to wanting to show off what he could do on a wrestling standpoint, but also because he wanted to redeem himself after his poor performance on last season. So he ended his challenge one on a good note. Darrell had this argument with Abram. He won his third season in a row. Darrell was pretty much Darrell. You're not really going to get much else from him. Now, when it comes to the rookies, like the first Inferno, I do think that the rookies are the weakest element. Where, one, I do give them props for not casting many of them. There's only 5 rookies on the season, but that was also a sign that they needed some new blood, and this was the case because Road Wolves was officially cancelled, so they didn't have anywhere else to go and cast from, and they were solely reliant on Real World. So I think due to the limited casting pool with this season and around this point in time, I think that's why they decided to do a fresh meat season 2 seasons after this. So looking at this, only 3 of them never returned again, i.e. Jamie, Sharonda, and Karamo. Obviously, Karamo and Jamie would go on to have successful careers in the business. The only one out of these 3 who were somewhat interesting were Karamo, but he came off as more pathetic than anything. Sharonda and Jamie were very, very, very forgettable, but props to Jamie for winning. That means Landon and Jody were the only 2 who returned after the season, but if you look at their seasons, they didn't really do a whole lot afterwards. And they were more known for their Era 2 runs than their Era 1 run, though that would always be the case since they debuted in the final Era 1 season. I feel like Landon's personality was definitely the biggest and the most interesting here, as he was a lot more fun. He definitely had a petty side to him. He got drunk a few times, where in the other seasons he was just totally focused on competition. Jodie was definitely a lot more messier here as she got into her hookups. She did get into drama, though she kind of let herself get frazzled here and there, though she's more known for her runs on the Gauntlet and the Duel. And obviously she returned a few years ago to do spin-offs like All-Stars 2 and World Championship, and she is now on Battle of the Eras. So there was the whole mess with the Robin, Tanya, and Beth argument over whether Tanya and Mark allegedly slept with one another or not. That was definitely something. Tanya versus the Mean Girl trio was definitely a storyline of the season, though it went too far with them taking nude photos of her and showing it to people in the house. Dan was funny as hell in the season, and he really was just an electric rod of humor. That was something that I forgot to mention throughout the season, so I really did appreciate his contributions, though he kind of teamed up with the Mean Girl trio at a certain point in time. And it was a very fun watch. The format was just like the first Inferno, where there was the daily nominations in one episode, the lifesavers and the eliminations in the next episode. It was very consistent with that, and overall, it's just a very fun watch. And that's where the era ends. So you definitely see the progress between the first season all the way up until the 10th. So now I'm going to talk about the people who I see as the faces of Era 1. And this means they competed on a decent amount of seasons. They had big personalities, or they were given a lot of screen time on their seasons. They were able to make cameos or hosted a few other seasons. They had a lot of the storylines revolve around them, a lot of the strategy and the gameplay revolve around them. They dominated their seasons, and when you really think of the first 10 seasons, you really think of these people due to what they contribute all around. So I'm going to go in chronological order. So honestly, Eric is the one that I was kind of iffy on, but he was on the very first challenge season. Now it's known as the very first challenge season. He was able to host season 5, and it's rare for people who would become challengers or were challengers to host a season. He dominated season 6 and season 9, but a part of me was iffy about putting him on here because I kind of feel like he was the sidekick to Mark. But when you really think of Battle of the Sexes and how those two seasons took place, you kind of have to include him. And I think one of the reasons why I'm kind of iffy on him is that his impact after Era 1, when you think of Era 1 in the years after Era 1 took place, a lot of people don't really think of him, and he's very insular to this era, even compared to A Miz, where he at least hosted the Challenge vs. Star spin-offs, and he obviously became a lot more famous after the challenge. So I spoke about one of them, and now I have to move on to Mark, the Godfather. It's pretty obvious. He took part on what at the time was seen as the first challenge season, with season 2 being seen as the first challenge season then, and a lot of people still see it as that now. Obviously, he won that season, he was the leader on that season. So technically, he was the first alumni to host something, which wasn't the case for Eric, as Mark hosted the season 4 reunion, then he moved on to hosting season 5, the entire season with Eric, and then Mark did, of course, both Battle of the Sexes seasons. He won the first one. He lost the second one, so Eric could win. That's one of the more memorable moments here. His relationship with Robin started becoming a lot more focused on during the tail end of this era, even when he wasn't on a season, so like Inferno 2. His name caused a lot of drama with that whole mess between Beth, Tanya, and Robin. And when you really think of the person who started and who's a part of the foundation of the challenge, you think of Mark. Veronica is pretty similar to Mark in the case where she's really the first woman who got a lot of focus on the show. She was on season 3. At the time, it was called season 2. She ended up doing the most seasons out of everyone in this era, as I believe she did 7 seasons out of 10, and that's a whole lot for someone in this era. A lot of people who are the faces of this era only did half as many seasons as she did. So that's one of the reasons why she's on here. Though she did pretty poorly on season 5 and season 6, but I do think on a character and a competitive point of view, she grew into her own in season 7. She became a lot more cutthroat because she was screwed over a few times. She eventually got with the other veteran women and they started running things, and that led up into the last 4 seasons of this era. I could talk about Mike and Cole at the same time. I probably will, since they are so intertwined with one another. But I feel like with the first 3, they kind of had their gaps, especially with Eric and Mark mainly doing the Battle of the Sexes seasons, and Veronica having a few poor performing seasons. Mike and Cole are really the first people when you think of the faces where they did several seasons in a row. I believe the only season that they missed for Mike, I think he did season 5, 7, 8, 9, 10, so he missed the first Battle of the Sexes. Cole did all those seasons, but she missed the first Battle of the Sexes and the Inferno 2. Their interactions with one another, whether they are best friends, whether they are plotting, whether they are arguing, was such a huge focus throughout all of that. A lot of those second half of Era 1 seasons. Their hookups got a lot of focus. They were great competitors. They either won, I think they won season 5, and then they got runner ups for most of their other seasons. You really think of them, they always had the most not diary rooms, the most confessionals on the seasons they were in. Kind of like Mark on his seasons as well. They really just brought everything that you needed to bring for Era 1. Mike's definitely a bit more insular compared to Akora, as she did a few Era 2 seasons, where the only time he came back to the challenge was to host the Champs vs. Star seasons, but that does give him an advantage over Eric, and of course he had the showman's drama as well that Eric didn't have, since I believe he was married the entire time. So now we're moving on to Theo, who's a very good competitor. I think he won a few seasons, and yeah, he almost always made the finals. He was very humorous. They gave him a lot of confessionals with his jokes. He had a lot of playful rivalries. He had his hookups, especially with Tanya, and I'm pretty sure there might be someone else. I think he did 3 seasons in the era, and he did well in all of them, so that's why he is on here, and they pushed him in a lot of the specials and stuff like that. Rachel is definitely someone who was kind of interesting because she did 4 seasons in this era. She was mid-ish boot on both Battle of the Sexes seasons, but her blindsides on both of those seasons are such a huge part of the era, and when people think of Era 1, they think of those moments. The first one was just a huge blindside. The second one, they were clearly building it up because she was seen as the main villain of the women on Battle of the Sexes too, so they're clearly building up to her blindside. And then she dominated the Gauntlet and the Inferno too. She got into a lot of drama. Obviously, she didn't get into a lot of hookups since I think they didn't really cast many bisexual or lesbian women. Oh, I forgot to mention on the Inferno 2 review that Veronica and Rachel were apparently dating at around the time of the Inferno 2 and maybe some of the other seasons, but they didn't do anything on camera because I think Veronica didn't want to be out yet. Of course, Anissa revealed that on Dirty 30, but we'll get to that when we eventually get to it. Rachel really started getting pushed a lot during the later seasons, and that's why she is here. Abram is someone who I was kind of iffy on putting on here since he debuted on season 7, and with lists like these, people who debut later on in the era usually have their impact in the beginning of the next era, or they're just overshadowed by the people who are on the first or the middle portions. But because of the weird insular vibe of the first 4 seasons, and then clearly splitting up some of the veterans, the ones who did Battle of the Sextons and the one who did the others, it caused Abrams to be booted here. His personality was pushed hardcore on the show. He was a great competitor in most of the seasons that he was in. He did get into a few showmatches here and there, and then he got into a lot of conflict as well. And the final person that I'm discussing here is Tina. And honestly, I did debate with her because one, she debuted on season 7, so kind of the same thing with Abram. She was booted pretty early on in season 7, though she did have her memorable moments there. But she came back for season 9 and 10. She really just took off in those seasons. She did really well on those 2 seasons. She was booted right before the final in season 9. She made it to the final in season 10. She got a lot of confessionals in those 2 seasons. She was one of the main narrators of those seasons. She got into a whole lot of drama there, and she became a good competitor here. And with her association with Rachel and Veronica, and then being branded as the Mean Girl Trio, that is why I pushed her on here, though you could argue that she will be in the next tier, which I am going to talk about just now. So this next group of people are the ones who I call notable supporting characters, where they did a decent amount of seasons. Some of them are known for being game players, some of them are known for the big personalities, some are known because they're drama magnets, some are known because they're strategists. They have a few of the categories, but they're missing something that causes them to be the faces of the show. Some of them are that in the few seasons they did, they were booted too early, too often, or they got minimal edits on some of their seasons. Some of them only have that one major category, but they're missing 1 or 2 major ones to become faces of the show, but they're still notable in regards to Era 1. So, of course, we have Beth, where I think they went to her house in season 1, but we all know that's a retroactive season. The only season she did well on in this era is season 2, where no one went home. She was on Battle of the Seasons and Battle of the Sexist One, but she was booted immediately from there. She wasn't on the next few seasons after that. And then she was on the Inferno 2, where she did cause quite a stir with the Mark mess, but she did quit pretty early. So she kind of missed the boat beginning being a face here. And I feel like her more memorable moments are on Era 2 anyways. Cyrus did, I think, like 3 or 4 seasons in this era. He was never really the main character. He never really had a whole bunch of storylines. They did show a lot of his not diary rooms, his confessionals and his moments where he's pretty funny. And they did make fun of him for being an older guy. I guess him and Beth also had that as well. But in general, he just didn't make it to the faces list, so he is here. Julie is an interesting one. I do feel like she was definitely given a lot of focus on Extreme Challenge and the Inferno. So in those 2 seasons, she could have been the face, or she had the potential to be a face, but something was just missing. Obviously, she was booted first on Battle of the Sexes 1, so that dampened her from being in that category. And then on the Inferno 2, while she made it far, she had a minimal edit, and I do feel like she's trying to self-edit herself so she could come off looking good, so that's why she's here, since she's notable, but she's not a face. Emily is someone who I feel like definitely could have been a face had she continued. She brought a lot of mess to Battle of the Seasons, and especially Battle of the Sexes. One where she got a lot of focus there. She was very cutthroat. She got into a lot of drama. She was a good competitor, but she stopped after the first Battle of the Sexes, so she didn't have the amount of seasons. And she's kind of insular because she wasn't a part of the latter 4 seasons of the era, which are kind of what the challenge came to be. Dan is someone who was on 3 seasons. He did well enough on all 3 of them, but the only thing he really has is his humor and his comic relief. He didn't really get into many storylines. He did have some drama on the Inferno too, but it was clear that he just wasn't given main character energy. He wasn't edited in that manner. Timmy is kind of similar as well, where I don't recall him ever getting into any sort of drama. He was a very good competitor. I don't remember him being a strategist much, but when you're a good competitor, especially in this era, you don't really need it. But he's mainly just humorous, so yeah. Anissa is the woman who ended up doing the most seasons out of any woman in the challenge history, but I was kind of shocked when watching her 2 seasons on here. One, she's on this list because she only did 2 seasons in the era, and 2, she really wasn't given a whole lot of focus on either season. She really wasn't memorable on her first season. She really wasn't a strong competitor. She wasn't a weak competitor in the 2 seasons, but she wasn't the strongest either. She was very middle of the road. I do feel like she got into a bit more drama in her second season, so you can clearly tell that they're starting to slowly build her up here, but she just didn't have what it takes to be in that upper tier due to lack of seasons and lack of competitiveness, and she didn't have a whole lot of drama. Tanya is someone that I feel kind of similarly about in this regard too. She was very unmemorable in her first 2 seasons. She was also booted early on the Inferno. It really wasn't until Battle of the Sexes 2 where she got a lot of focus when it comes to her showmances. She became a better competitor in the Inferno 2, and she got into a lot of drama during those 2 seasons. So there's potential there for her to be a face, but it just wasn't accomplished in this era. Maybe once we get to era 2, she might get bumped up, but yeah. Shane's pretty much very similar to Dan in the regards that they never made gay men the faces of the era. He always got a supporting character edit. He was a nice enough guy. I think he did 3 seasons. He did well enough in all 3 of those seasons, so he had that going for him. He was a pretty solid competitor, though he wasn't good or great compared to some of the greats. He wasn't as funny as a Dan. I don't recall him getting into any sort of drama, so that's kind of why he is here. Rosie did 2 seasons on the era, both Battle of the Sexes, and because she only did 2 seasons, I couldn't put her on the upper tier, and she was a very good competitor on her first season, and she was solid in her second season. But the issue with Rosie is that she really only has the competition. She really doesn't have a big personality, and you can't really be a face of this show, especially when you don't really have the personality, you don't really have any interesting dynamics, you're not really strategic at all, so that's why she is here. Darrell is someone who started off on a hot streak. He won his first 3 seasons. He's going to win his 4th season in Era 2. But despite that, he was never really a major player in the edit in any of these seasons. He was always the supporting character. He had very good confessionals and soundbites. he had these random spurts of drama, but they were never really edited like they were a storyline. So I feel like he's a decent and consistent enough supporting player. That's why he is here. Trishelle is someone that could have been a face if she did more seasons in the era. Her relationship with Mike got a lot of focus on her first season. Her interactions with Mike and Coral definitely got much focus. They put her on a few specials, so they're clearly trying to promote her. But she just flamed out on her second season as she was an early boot, and she never came back. But she's still pretty notable, which is why she is here. Katie is someone that I could have put on the face tier like I did with Tita, as they were both early boots on their first season. They both had very good second seasons. Katie got into a lot of drama with Veronica on her second season. She had a very good underdog arc where she ended up winning the season despite her being on the outs. But her third season was very quiet and very under the radar, and she was booted midway, so I feel like that kind of just took her essence in becoming a potential face, despite them pushing her on the show and on the specials a lot, where Tina just continued to grow and grow. So I think that's why I put Tina in a face there and Katie in this tier. CT is someone who will definitely become one of the faces of the show in the next 3 eras. But in this era, he just wasn't it at all. One, he debuted very late into the era, and people who debut late into an era are always at a disadvantage since they miss most of the seasons. And in the 2 seasons he did, which were the Inferno and the Inferno 2, he really wasn't given the main character focus. He didn't get the most confessionals, he wasn't involved in a lot of the storylines. He did get into his random fights here and there, and he was a very good competitor, but he wasn't given a lot of the narration, and he was just overshadowed by a lot of the other more established people on the show. And Brad, someone who debuted literally at the tail end of the era where he did season 9 and season 10, he made it very far on his first season. He was able to catch up with the veteran man. He had one of the more memorable moments on the season where he was brutally backstabbed, and he did hold a grudge. And then there's this Reggie moment in season 10, and he got into his fair share of drama there, and he did decently on there. But he only did 2 seasons, he debuted at the tail end, and he just couldn't compare with many of the others who were more established, which is why he is here. So this next section is for people who I feel like are the best competitors. So one of the rules that I had is that they had to do at least a few seasons in the era, so no one season wonders, and not someone who did well on one season but performed poorly on others. So I tried to spread it out as much as possible. Obviously, with the first 4 seasons, it's kind of hard to tell who's the best of the best just based on how they decide to design those first few seasons. Obviously, Mark did well in the second season, and then he essentially ran the Battle of the Sexes seasons competitively. The only reason why he lost the second one is because he intentionally lost. It wasn't because he was a poor competitor. Dan is someone who did 3 seasons, and he dominated all 3 of his seasons. So while he doesn't really have much of anything else, he definitely has the competitiveness in him. Theo's pretty self-explanatory here. He made it to the finals in all of the seasons that he did on the era, if I'm remembering correctly. Ruthie is someone who had a very strong first season competitively, and she did better than most of the guys on the first Battle of the Sexes. And while she didn't do as well on the second Battle of the Sexes, she still did very well, and she went out in the second to last round before the finals. And she's one of the few women who was able to be decent in the competitions. Rachel is interesting because she had 2 mediocre performances, though the reason why she went early on the Battle of the Sexes seasons was never because she was poor competitively. They acknowledged that she was good competitively despite her early boots. And then in the other seasons, like the Inferno 2 and the Gauntlet, we saw how good she was competitively. Veronica is someone who definitely started off on a more rocky place in this regard. Though we saw in the latter 3 to 4 seasons, she really grew as a competitor, and she won many eliminations. She was one of the few people who saved a lot of her teams in some of the missions and the lifesavers, so yeah. Timmy is also someone who did very well in the competitions, but it was almost forgotten about because there's always so many people who are good in the competitions, or he just didn't need to brag about it like some of the others. Coral was someone who was always a strong and consistent performer, with the exception of the Gauntlet, but she started coming into her own on the Battle of the Sexes 2, where she really showed that she is a very good competitor, though she did well in her first 2 seasons in this regard as well. And the final person that I am putting here is CT, as he won a lot of lifesavers on both Inferno seasons, so I think he did more on the second Inferno, and he was always a very good team contributor on his team. And he was definitely the best of the best in the Inferno too. So there are people that I am missing, so like Mike the Miz and Adora. And while they are solid competitors, they never really had any strong individual performances, and they were usually on a team with stronger competitors, which is why they made it to the finals. So that's why they're not the best of competitors. If I cared enough to do a second tier of competitors, which I don't, since in general I don't really talk a lot about the challenges on my reality TV reviews, I would definitely put them on there, but they just ended up missing it, so here they are. Alrighty, so that is my overall commentary on Era 1. It was very interesting to watch and delve deep into the foundational era of the challenge. A lot of these seasons did not age well just from a formatting point of view, and I don't see myself watching a decent amount of those seasons again, so mainly the ones from the first half. They really started getting it together during the second half of the era when it comes to the personality, the theming, the direction, and the vets that they wanted to focus on. Obviously, you can't really compare these seasons to the latter seasons because one, all of them are team seasons. Two, some of them don't even have eliminations, and the ones where people do get voted, do leave early, are voted out. So there's a lot of reasons as to why you can't compare these seasons to the latter seasons. But there's definitely a lot of fun in these seasons, and you could definitely tell that this is the summer camp era. And while this was starting to end in the latter 2 to 3 seasons, it would be nowhere near as dark as Era 2 would get to. And I'm definitely looking forward to Era 2 because you start to see the formula get a lot more stabilized in comparison. A lot of the veterans and the stars from this era starts to fade out, and we get a whole bunch of new stars. Some of the people who debuted late in this era became a lot of the stars for the second era, and it'll be interesting to see how the challenge coexisted with a lot of the other reality shows in the mid to late odds. So that is something I'm definitely looking forward to. And in the middle of watching the Gauntlet 2 for this review, so that should be out sooner rather than later. Thank you all for watching. You can follow, like this channel, my other channel, and I'll be back with more commentary soon. Bye!